All right. So it's a pleasure and honor to be with you today. So let's begin the conversation about the use of storyboard approach in nursing practice. And just to update you, I did recently retire, so I am now doing nursing consulting work. So where to begin? It's always best to begin at the beginning. And when we think about storyboards or stories, one immediately thinks of the classic fairy tales, where it always begins with once upon a time. We tend to think about the stories that we have been told in the past and how they become integrated with our outlook and approach to things that happen later in life. We tend to share our experiences by conversation and action and build on them as we continue in our life adventure. There are both good and bad association with stories and lived experiences that we use as a point of reference. Our stories become examples to live by. So let's begin with once upon a time. Typically, we look at the past to help us manage the present and then look towards the future. When you're looking at storyboards, Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the first person of historical interest that developed the concept of storyboards. They were actually visual depictions of the sketches that allowed one to have insight into the thought process. If we fast forward to modern time, we have Walt Disney, who used storyboards to tell his stories in animated films and cartoons. Each scene depiction was graphed out sequentially, and the sketches were flipped into cell drawings to literally tell that story. If we think of the words of Walt Disney, if you can dream it, you can do it. And think about all of the innovative stories that Disney was able to tell and share with the world. So let's use a little magic to get us started. What does the literature tell us? In terms of literature, we can not only look at the classic narrative, for example, fairy tales like Hans Christian Andersen and also look at evidence-based practice to find out about the concept of storyboards when applied to clinical practice. I actually did 2 searches, one with PubMed, an advanced search looking at storyboard in clinical practice, 16 results, and one with just a general Google search using the title. So what did I find out? Well, evidence-based practice tells us that the concept of storyboards is a narrative experience, which is merely a written or spoken account of a story that uses a concept to help one form a connection. Through the medium of narrative, nurses have an opportunity to learn from each other and create a future that promotes integrity, trust, and professionalism, a future in which nurses seek to listen, to understand, and where necessary, act. Universality of visual narratives is a fundamental human expression that requires fluency for exposure. It can be applied in general as well as specific terms mediated by that exposure. Doesn't have to be symmetrically applied, but it is a complex system. Pictorial representations of story components are prepared and organized sequentially to guide the production of work. Each frame of the storyboard is a graphic representation of a part of the story being told. The tool can be adapted for professional education, so this is not just unique to nursing. This is applied in any discipline of learning. It also can be used to minimize the gap between theory and practice. How many times do you have students in an academic setting that seem to get the material, but then when they go to a clinical setting, can't apply the information? The other thing that storyboards help us with is a lived experience. You can enhance it with photo boards to supplement the experience, and it definitely can be used as a teaching strategy, both by the educator and actually by the student learners, whereby students are using the storyboard to tell their perception of content learning events. And lastly, a storyboard is basically a collage of information. It's a visual representation of a subject or subject matter. So let's expand on the research. Why use storyboards at all, specifically in terms of nursing? Well, they're practical approaches to textbook solutions. They help to engage and retain that information. They give a framework for future application and analysis. You either can set up storyboards where you give them the information and say, this is let's say, a scenario about pancreatitis, or you could just give them a storyboard and have them play detective and figure out what the clinical concept is. And also it organizes a file cabinet approach in one's critical thinking and clinical decision-making sphere. If they've had practice with a concept and applied it, then they're more likely to retain it. So how do we incorporate storyboards into your educational experience? Again, content or theme. Sometimes less can be more. You can do a storyboard graphic, like a one-page dynamic, or you can do a PowerPoint series. When we're going to give an example later on in this discussion, we're going to use a PowerPoint template. We do this to capture one's attention. We use the imagination to think both inside and outside the box and get people to really become engaged in the learning environment. So let's look at this template, okay? This PowerPoint template can be used to tell one story in terms of a clinical context. So the storyboard at its origin begins with a concept, then an outline, and then the actual content is immersed into the narrative. So this template that I chose, you have the patient, the discussion, the diagnosis, the treatment, the monitoring. So you're setting this up into themes. So the first thing in terms of a storyboard is you need to take a brief look at the process, and you have to start out with a patient. So let's enter the clinical environment here. And depending on where you are in the learning process, as I said, you can either provide the subject content area, such as pancreatitis, appendicitis, or you can let the students play detective and say, what do you think? What's going on with this patient? So the first thing you do is create a patient, okay? So in this case, the storyboard I'm using, has these differentials, but you can certainly add more. So we can do, male or female, trans patient, whatever, you want to get across to the student. And I selected a patient, a female patient. And again, this is just a sort of example. I gave age, a gender, no allergies, a location. And then I started giving somewhat of a past medical history. So, obviously, if you're looking at this is an obstetrical case study, gravida and para. And so we, start out in 2005, and then we go to 2010, 2022, and 2025. So we see that the person had, previously two deliveries, no problems. The third delivery is stillborn, and now fast forward on the fourth pregnancy, that person is at 38 weeks. And even just with this snapshot, you're thinking, well, wait a second, this person is probably, and their family is thinking, what's going on with this pregnancy? Am I going to have a positive outcome? Even though I have two living children, the last pregnancy I had was a stillbirth. So there's a lot of things going on in the minds of this patient and this family. Well, now you need to do a review of systems. And every story needs additional information on the form of a background to help one dig deeper. And for our purposes, I've indicated the symptoms of interest in italics. So this patient has fatigue, nausea, anxiety, things that would be consistent, you would think, with what I described initially. So then you have in the storyboard, as you're developing, what questions do you want to ask initially? How long has this been going on? Is there a pattern? There's a baseline. What's going on in her current pregnancy? What happened in her past pregnancies? What other questions would you like to ask your patient? And this is an important fact in storyboards and clinical training is what else? What do you think? What do you need to know? Nobody provides everything. And you can ask the same question, unfortunately or fortunately, to a patient or a physician, and you get a different answer. So it's very important to think about, well, what other questions would you like to ask? Think inside and outside the box. And what other sources of information might be useful? So, let's look at professional history, family, personal, peers, internet. Is your patient diagnosing themselves by the internet? You want to know what's going on. Next, we have the physical exam. And again, very, very important. This is where sometimes there's a noticeable gap, deficit in clinical practice. By provider, I mean physicians as well as nurses. Some providers immediately proceed to a focused assessment rather than look at the patient holistically. Some providers skip the entire physical exam in the clinical setting and focus on their computer documentation rather than interacting with the patient. So if you learn one thing today in our conversation, bring back the physical exam. It's really, really important. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and inspection and observation often form the cornerstone of any story. If one tells the story in the dark with all of the lights off, then it's very easy to miss items with the naked eye. I'm going to see if this link works here. So here is a link to a storyboard scenario that I created a while ago for RN to BSM program. So it's basically a one-page visual. It gives you, again, it's a labor and delivery type of story. It gives you a little introduction. And then if you go over the little highlights here, little buttons, it gives you additional information. And what I did and use this in this particular thing, let's see if we can get back to the storyboard here. Okay, there we go. So what I did with those particular scenarios, I developed 30 different scenarios for students and this randomized approach, and they got that visual. They also got a written transcript of it. So they, in case they, would miss things, and then they were asked certain questions about it throughout the course of the course and different applications. So again, it doesn't have to be just one assignment. It can be a cumulative assignment. So I cannot stress enough that the story should include either physical or mental picture description. Documentation should be comprehensive, and trending of results cannot be effective if one doesn't have the initial image of the clinical event. So let's look a little bit again at this scenario, this storyboard snapshot. There's an equal focus on relevant concerns for this patient: labs, pelvic exam, and fetal heart tones. So with every pregnant patient, remember there are at least 2 patients, maternal and fetal. So these are the things that your student should be concerned with. Moving forward for the discussion, I gave a nurse and 2 physicians. So we want to bring providers in for a discussion on rounds, and we want to use an interdisciplinary approach. So the nurse, Meow, she's concerned with the patient family related to the prior stillbirth. This particular physician in the middle, he's concerned with the best delivery approach. And the other physician would be a neonatologist, and that person is looking overall at improving maternal fetal outcomes. So we want to use a comprehensive approach with mental and physical well-being serving as the cornerstone, and we want to build a common plan to improve outcomes. So moving forward in the storyboard, we're looking at diagnosis or examinations. What would be appropriate in this case? So based on the history, you're looking at the mother. We're thinking possibly the impact of stress and anxiety for the prior stillborn, and that this patient is now considered a high-risk patient, where previously with her pregnancy, she was not. If we look at the fetal aspect, we're looking at maintaining fetal well-being, again, prior stillborn, monitoring during and intrapartum and once the baby is delivered, and of course, a neonatologist to be present at birth. So what needs to be done to arrive at a diagnosis, and what impact might it have on the actual outcome event? So moving forward in terms of the treatment, prior to labor, maternal well-being, weekly monitoring, looking at vital signs, is this patient having problems? Fetal monitoring, weekly monitoring. Again, are we hearing a heartbeat? Do we have to do non-stress tests or a biophysical profile to determine fetal well-being? Again, to prevent poor outcomes. When we look at comparisons, again, This is the differential diagnosis, and the nurse is always part of the patient care and therefore should be part of the review of the differential diagnosis. So just the very few things that we have, I didn't mention bleeding, but possibly, bleeding could occur. We did mention anxiety, nausea, fatigue. Look at the history, look at the causes, and look at the impact of how this can contribute and affect outcomes. Other parts of the storyboard for consideration. What do you plan to do while you're taking care of the patient? So we presented a lot of information, and now we can turn it around back to the student or the provider that we're using this scenario with and say, well, what do you want to do? And then what are the indications and contraindications within the standard of care? So develop the dialogue. In terms of getting to the conclusion, do you know what helps make your point clear? So in terms of ending the story, what do you want the reader to know? Sometimes once they've gone through a storyboard, you can provide a listing of outcomes. You can provide best practice examples. And most important thing, you want the audience to get the point of your presentation. So you want to have some discussion and some dialogue with them following this type of storyboard modality. References, absolutely. Need references. Evidence-based practice, you can either provide them or you can have the student or provider taking the storyboard provide you with them. And then resources, you can develop your own or you can use templates or interactive support to generate your storyboard. So I showed you the example of the storyboard that I created, just a one-page dynamic, but we also can use PowerPoint like this template to do it. So how many stories do you have to tell? So the reason for thinking about the stories, and again, showing my age now, as especially in the United States, we had soap operas. And what they did was they would tell a story in a half hour, 5 days a week, and people would sort of get addicted to these stories. This one that I used to watch actually started in 1956, and no, I didn't start watching it then. I was a little bit too young. It ended in 2010. It was called As the World Turns, and most of the soap operas, again, involve medical scenarios. So this was the last episode, the last snippet for this As the World Turns.
A 3% IRA match with Robin Gold, reckoning house commenced. But it's an ordinary town where something extraordinary happens every day.
So,
One more thing to do. What's that for?
just a little encouragement.
I didn't realize how hard it would be to say goodbye.
Well, darling, I don't think there should be goodbyes. Just I'll meet you out in the car. Take as much time as you need.
Well, let's fast forward, okay? And now look at the storyboards that we have today. ER started in 1994, it ran 15 seasons. And now we have the Pit, which is a real life ER doctor, which started actually in 2025. So I don't know how many of you have watched that, but it's certainly something to see. I can tell you with storyboards years ago when I watched ER True Story, they give you the highlights. And I said to my husband, oh, gee, I know what's going to happen. And he went, no, you don't. And I went, oh, yeah, I think I do know what's going to happen with this patient. He says, no. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll write it down. I wrote everything down, put it in an envelope, sealed it. At the end of the show, he opened up the envelope and he went, oh my God. And it actually was a labor patient, OB patient who went and developed preeclampsia, toxemia, and DIC and died. So again, that was the initial storyboards. So if you do get a chance to watch The Pit in terms of real life emergency medicine, I highly recommend it. Okay, well, thank you for sharing some time for me. If you have any questions, you can contact me via LinkedIn, and I'm gonna just stop sharing right now.